If you look at the title, the first section of the title looks very clear, but if you go to the second layer of the title, it looks slightly abstract. So let me begin with the first section of the presentation, which is about decolonizing nation state. I'm of the view that, we have been loosely using the very term nation state. That's my first take for the scholars here, that we have been loosely using in political science the very idea of nation state. And I'll give you the problematic areas of using this loosely, because as a student of political science and theory, we are supposed to be using concepts very carefully. If you go by David Hell, he would say, it's a network of concepts. And without this network of concepts, we just cannot have political theory. And that has to be also systematic in some ways, because it has to testify to the needs of time and criticisms that you will face. Having said this, I think the very idea of nation state has to be first of all problematized. Can there be something like state nation instead of nation state? That's my second take. Nation state would be that entity which has a very huge congruency between the boundary and the culture. That is the first explanation to the very notion of nation state. But if you go deeper and deeper into the state systems that we have today, particularly in South Asia, it looks like the boundary of the nation and the nation itself sometimes is not so congruent. Therefore, it looks like the sequencing would be better if we have also open to the sequence of state-nation, right? That's number one. I think this is a very big theoretical dimension. It is a big legal dimension, and we cannot undermine the significance of how constitutions were born if you really want to explain these sequence. Let me begin with the Westphalian model of state. And I think we, being associated with political science and social sciences, fairly aware of the fact that the Westphalian state was basically a model of state which is more about territoriality and sovereignty. It was nothing about nation, right? There was not much talk about the congruency of the border and the people, or the culture and the border, right? So Westphalian model of state is the modern origin of the state that we have today. But as time progressed, people begin to understand that that was not sufficient. Mere respect for sovereignty and territory was not just sufficient, because that has to have a strong support of people and the will of the people. And there come in people like Hegel, for instance, who would say that a state is a march of God on earth. Why? Because it really represents the will of the people, because it is based on the consciousness of the people and rationality of the people. So the very idea of state for him was like God coming on earth and making you happy and perfect, and your rights being represented properly, your consciousness being taken care of, and your security being given properly. That was the imagination of state he had. In that notion of state, the very idea of congruency was not so important, because it was embodying the necessity elements that the state was supposed to have. So that is one aspect which was like promotion of or enriching of the Westphalian model. But I think Rousseau actually took up the case again, and he found that the way in which the states were imagined was not really good, because the liberal representative form of government was not really doing well, and he was not expecting it to do well in future. And yes, he was born in Geneva, and then he had to be exiled because he was threatened by the radicals, because he was talking about direct democracy. He thought that the liberal democracy that the Locke and James Mill imagined was not sufficient for a modern state to be really a nation state. So therefore he was talking about confederation, number one. Number two, he was talking about direct democracy. And as you rightly pointed out, so in the beginning, that why not small states? And I think Rousseau was almost getting back to the Greek city-state model, where the state should have been smaller in size, because that will actually enhance the idea of direct democracy. My point here is that referring to Rousseau, you can see that he was going to have a huge contradiction with the very nature and the manner in which liberal democracies were to progress, and he was not going to be comfortable with the project of French Revolution, for instance. I mentioned about Rousseau being born in Geneva, and then he had to flee his own homeland, and he could come back much later in his life. But we identify him more as a French philosopher, not as Swiss philosopher. It has a reason, because he had to flee his homeland and then work in France, and even in France he was not really safe. So what I'm saying is this is because his ideas were actually replicated and followed in Swiss federal model, which they call confederation. So whereby you have 3 cantons, and the 3 cantons are given equal rights, right? And lot of respect in terms of constituting a state, and most visibly they become the nation state, because they've been able to take care of the necessary elements of a nation state, whereby the 3 different linguistic communities can come together and form a nation. So in that sense, I think Rousseau's political philosophy is a great upgradation that is required to be a nation state, and he gives you all the materials that can be looked into to create a nation state, because he is not only happy with the very idea of consensus and the social contract. His idea of social contract is much deeper in comparison to the former philosophers, maybe Hobbes, Locke, right? So therefore I think the very sequencing of the nation state or a state nation shall have to be looked into the manner in which the social contracts are being signed when you write constitutions. Because constitution is the written contract that you can see, because there is a hypothetical imagination and in the legal processing that the citizens and the state is perhaps signing a contract with the state they are constituting. So in that manner, I think Rousseau has given us a very, very important insight into how states can become nations, where they can confederate, where they can take care of different cultures and linguistic communities. That is one aspect. I think Switzerland is today regarded to be as one of the most successful federal models. Not only federal, because they're almost going beyond even more than being a federal state, right? So that is one aspect. That's why the very idea of decolonizing nation state is going to be historical in terms of the history of philosophy, which talks about the authentic representation of the people, of the will of the people, right? And the constant ability of the people to directly participate in the making of a nation state. That is very important. That is the reason why I think if we have to talk about these philosophers, they had the concern to decolonize or to give a decolonial model of state nation or nation state. That is one dimension. There are 3 important points that I want to discuss with you as far as the significance of federating models are concerned, or confederating model of federalism or nation state is concerned. One is it gives you a higher perspective on the consent. The idea of consent that we normally perceive to be is not so high in terms of what Rousseau was trying to get. So therefore I think if you talk about confederation, you sense that Rousseau was much more ambitious in comparison to other scholars. So that is one. Number 2, I also think that Rousseau has also contributed in terms of producing higher form of representation, because he was preferring to essentialize 2 important dimensions of federalism or making a nation state, and you can see which is being practiced in Switzerland today, which we call recall system and referendum system. So these are some very important mechanisms through which the connection between the citizen and the state is being renewed in much more a moral and consensual way. So in the case of India, probably when you elect somebody, there's no provision as such to call them back, and it becomes quite helpless for us that we have elected somebody who is very wrong to represent us, but by the time you're too late to recall them back. Now it looks like it is impossible for you to recall them immediately, but you perhaps have to wait for much more longer time, which is not the case in the Swiss model. So I think that these very practices of institutions is going to have a history. And the history is that you have philosophers like Rousseau, who was very adamant on these aspects of making a state and a nation, right? So therefore I think you need certain revisit of the philosophies that we have had, and that can really help you to decolonize state, because there is a need for decolonizing state because, or nation state, because the basic norms that govern modern civil society, the modern nation state, is to be about the actual representation, not the real representation, actual representation. So actual and the real has a difference, I guess. The MRP that you see is the real price. The actual price may be much lower than the MRP that you see on a commodity. So in that way, decolonizing nation state will require to go beyond the MRP of the nation states. You have to get into the actual price of the people and the state. So in that way, what I'm trying to do is that we have to relook into the loosely used notions like nation state, and I think it is better sometimes that you resequence and say that state nation, because it seems like many states today are in the making of becoming a nation, and it is struggling to become a nation, in fact. So it will be important to not to presume that you have a nation as a given commodity or a given entity, because it has a history of making, and that process was seen very much in the case of many other countries like France, for instance. Ernest Renan, if you read Ernest Renan, he was very, very unhappy with French Revolution. He was beginning to say that identity, religion, language, race was never going to be a sufficient condition for making a nation state. You have to go beyond that. So I think this was very well reflected in three important commissions of India. JBBB Committee 1946, I guess, 48, and Dhar Commission, and also the SRC, that is States Reorganization Commission. So all these three committees in India at the time of transition of power were aware of this facticity, that language was not supposed to be always the factor for making or reorganizing state. So I think that connection can be found there as well. But later on things turn out to be much different than what was imagined by those people who had some understanding of the difficulties and the challenges of reconfiguring states on the basis of race, religion, or identity. So I'll come to that part. So now I think we're fairly, my intention to do, to actually explain here is that we probably have to resequence our use of nation-state chronology. And I think this resequencing is even better, is even more democratic, because then you acknowledge that that nation making is a continuing project, and you have to have an opportunity to question the limitations that you have had so far. So that is one aspect. Now I talked about why confederation is a higher and better prospect of making a nation state, because, to repeat, it gives you a lot of consent, it gives you a lot of representation in terms of referendum and recall, and thirdly, it is much more than confactorial sharing of power. Confactorial would mean that the union will always have an upper hand. If you look at the Indian state system, the union government or the union parliament has always schemed things in such a way that it wants to have an upper hand in any form of legislative systems. So therefore, I think one has to be fair enough to say that, federal arrangement of state system is much more better in terms of real representation of people, right? So I'm not sure whether the theoretical readiness for these ideas is also going to be actually played out in our real political exchanges. That's a different question. So I want to also say that we can talk about another important federal scholar called Daniel Eleazar, who has almost become one of the prominent scholars on federalism, and he normally argues that the idea of self-rule should be also informed by the reality of shared rule. If you say that my language has to have a state, if you say my ethnicity has to have a state, that is called self-rule, for instance. But it has to go beyond that, because there is a possibility that you have to have a situation of sharing your self-rule with the overlapping identities. I'm using this term very consciously, the term overlapping. Overlapping identity has to be respected when you are vouching for self-rule. Because if you do not respect these overlapping spaces, what will happen is that your self-rule is going to be becoming exclusive and also depriving the other who's confined and located within that geographic space called territory of a state. And Manipur is a very, very classic example where there are around 35 recognized communities, and these communities are crisscrossingly inhabiting many areas. Once you see the inflation of the violence or the conflagration of the violence, there is a tendency that this idea of self-rule is being preached, and in the very process of clamoring for self-rule, you are also systematically creating an exclusive domain of your community, whereby finally you want to scheme that project as if you are alone and exclusively occupying that particular space. In that process, what happens is that violence becomes very imminent. The overlapping space, when you try to break it, when you want to separate it, it is very natural to have violence. And therefore, I am very fearful of the fact that this generic identity politics has a limitation. That limitation is that they try to end the overlapping spaces because they have a longer vision to clamor for an exclusive self-rule. I'm talking in terms of territoriality. So if you look from Delhi, you will probably not feel that much. But if you go and do a field work, you can see how separation is being preached so much as an essential element for dialogue or for even talking to each other. Now the condition is that you have to separate people first, and then we will come to a dialogue. That kind of thing is coming up, which I think is very unfair to the historicity of people who live together at certain juncture of history or in the past. And you have no right, I guess, no moral and normative right to separate people just for the sake of an identity politics that aims at having a self-rule for only somebody or for some identity, not for the whole region or for the whole community or the overlapping community. That is my kind of reading. That is the reason why I say that Article 3 is a question mark. Now, Article 3 of the Constitution says that the state's boundary can be altered, changed, or renamed by the Union Parliament without acquiring the consent of the states concerned. They can only ask for the views of the state. Now, my question is that India initially had about some 16 states. Now you have about 28 states. Imagine if India is going to have 1,000 states or 500 states. Now, people might say, if you follow Rousseau, for instance, or the Greek city-state model, you might probably say smaller states are very good. That's fine. The problem is, when you're trying to create these small states, there is one fundamental problem that you will encounter in the case of country like India, where you have multiple cultures overlappingly settled for 1,000 years or for centuries. Now, how do you resolve these overlapping areas? Because statehood movement in India is basically employing a very different kind of a trajectory, where it is coming more like as an exclusive project of a state for a particular community. Now, state to be defined in terms of a community was something that was never imagined in the very idea of the Constitution that you have in the country. As I mentioned about 3 important commissions, they were always very fearful of the possibility of numerous linguistic states, because you cannot afford to have linguistic states all the time, because in the northeastern region you have 200 cultural communities. If you even want to create 200 states in the northeast, I am fearing that how will you resolve the overlapping settlements of the people, because the conflicts have emerged because of that overlapping politics. So that is one aspect of my reading of Article 3. And interestingly, I want to quote Professor Balbir. I recently interacted with him and I raised this question to him. Sir, do you think that Article 3 still is required? Don't you think that there is a problem? How many times you will reorganize states in India? even if you reorganize also, what would be the basis of that reorganization? Because if you look at the reorganization movements, for instance, it is becoming identitarian in many sense. Then he said something very interesting. I think he never said this before, I guess, because he is a federal scholar known worldwide, because I am doing a bit of research on federal movements and federalism, and I'm writing papers on that. He said something interesting. He said, Noni, there should have been a sunset clause in Article 3. I'm repeating what he exactly said. He was saying that a couple of days back, just 2 days back, he was saying that there should have been a sunset clause in the Article 3 because the way it was imagined was very different from what it has been, perceived today. That was his reading. Now the point is, let's come to the issue of constitutionalism. It is I think I'm speaking not only about what particular state, I'm generally speaking how some aspects of the constitution, some aspects of nation making can be re-thought about. And I'm worried again that this very desire to have a state and homeland in a defined territory for a communitarian perspective is going to generate violence. That's my concern. Even if you have an option to give statehood to people without engineering this violence, then probably we can consider, I guess. And that is the main concern. You can see that identities are being weaponized. I use the term generic. If you say X identity itself is so diverse. I call it an umbrella identity. That umbrella, however, is an open umbrella. An open umbrella in the sense it is being opened, and you want to bring in certain people within the umbrella, within the shadow of that umbrella. Imagine if you don't want to become part of that shadow of the umbrella, you probably will be intimidated or be forced to become part of it. Now that process is very much inherent in identity politics. That is my take. When I was an undergraduate student, I was always fascinated by this identity and nationalism. But as I engaged with my own teachers, Manindra and others, they were always telling me, don't be so much in romance with identity. And it took about me, I took about 4 years to understand that, of course, identity politics has a problem. I'll tell you why identity politics has a problem. There are two layers of it. One is you have minority complex. At the same time, you have majority complex. Let me tell you this. Let me define the first. Minority complex in terms of the generic identity. They also carry the same kind of a logic called generic identity, even though you're a minority. Now, because they are in a constant struggle to create a generic identity to enforce themselves, to become bigger and to become stronger. That is very natural, right? At the same time, what happens is that this very generic identity in the name of a minority community, for instance, will probably be not so tolerant about the micro communities within that generic. So that's why I call the minorities also have a complex. The second aspect, the majority complex. The majority also becomes a minority all the time when they articulate, because they say they will be the next minority. They will be saying that they will be extinct. I call it prospective minority. So I think both of them are following almost same logic, because both of them are doing identity politics. And it becomes important for them to use these kind of narratives to convince people. And in the process, what they do is they kind of harm the solidarity that the communities had. You become so adamant to break that solidarity. You cannot be a farmer now. You cannot be a farmer. You cannot be a laborer. You cannot be a woman. You cannot be a transgender. And you cannot be a downtrodden class, because you are only an identity. I hope you get what I'm saying. Right? So class question will not emerge. Your gender question will not emerge. Your labor question will not emerge, because you have to always speak the language of identity. And if you talk to a co-fellow laborer from the other side of the community, you will be punished for that, because you infringed You actually derogated the very boundary that we erected called ethnicity and identity. So the two laborers on the same side, or the both sides cannot have interaction. The poor farmer will not be able to talk to the poor farmer on the other side because they are segregated by the line called ethnic lines. Now therefore, I think the biggest harm that this identity politics has done is killing the solidarities. And that is awakening people, and at the same time, this is also making institutions very difficult to operate, because democratic institutions will no more have that secular edge, because you have to reimagine institutions in a non-secular way. That is the reason why I say that even though identity is a reality and an actuality, but the manner in which it has to be articulated has to be re-questioned. That's my point. Nobody can deny that I'm a man, for instance. Nobody can deny that I'm a human being. But at the same time, the way I articulate my being as a human being will be very important, even though you say you're a human being. So in that perspective, I think we should not be swayed away easily by the binaries that we have been studying in our social sciences. Kindly think about the micro, parallel, smaller communities within those identities. Imagine 700 people, a community, a historical community, having only 700 people, recognized as a separate tribe and a community, but being subsumed increasingly by bigger communities. And they're fearing, they're crying, save us, save us. Our dresses are being taken away, our culture is being subdued, our practices have been, not allowed to be practiced. This is because there are deeper layers of identity politics happening. And this is very much a reality, an actuality in the regions where you have so many hundreds of cultures and diversities. From this, I think, perspective, I want to reimagine our understanding of ethnic conflict. We in the border, which is about 2,500 kilometers, we feel so disheartened when one left liberal would come forward and say that this is a majority and minority problem. This is a Christian and Hindu problem. I think this is an oversimplification sometimes. Of course, there may be an element of that. I don't deny outrightly. However, it is better also for you and for those people to go deeper into how the complexes of identity works. Right. So that is the reason why I say that a decolonization of nation state will be important, because the constitutionalism that I was supposed to talk, I'll revert back to that point. I think I have fairly talked about how Article 3 has to be reviewed. Now I want to come back to that point. I want to read Article 3 in conjunction with Article 1. As you all know, Article 1 says that India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. Now, there are three important references that we can begin with. If we talk about Article 3, the question of federalism is of course going to be there. And let's examine three important persons in the history of India. Jawaharlal Nehru in January 1947 used to say that the Indian Republic looks like going to be living and having monarchies within. I hope you get the point. Even though India was becoming a republic state, it was going to have monarchies, because not less than 565 princely states were there, and to integrate them was very, very difficult. By the time India got independence, the question of states were not settled. And moreover, 75 princely states had already written their constitution. There are references, archival sources for that. I repeat, 75 princely states had already written constitution. And some of them had already conducted elections by 1948. Manipur is one of them. It stands to be the most prominent, I guess. I'm not saying this. People like Fali Nariman has said in his book that Manipur went significantly ahead by writing a constitution and having an election on adult franchised. Similarly, the recent book published by Rohit Day, 2025, he says that India came into the way of Manipur's journey to democracy. So in Manipur wrote a constitution in 1947, 48 they conducted elections, and 49 they were met to merge and become part of India without consulting the Council of Ministers that was there, right? So I think Rohit Dey is hinting to the parallel constitutionalisms that was growingly coming up in India. And he is of the view that the Constituent Assembly of India did not pay sufficient attention to this growing constitutionalism in India. That is his kind of a take. Now, why is this aspect important? Because many of the resistance movements are relying or are derivative of this historical moment of being deprived. Then it comes back again to the whole question of how nation states are made, right? So I think making a nation state is a very complex and tedious process. It is a tedious process because even if you say that India is a union of state, for instance, but to make a union out of a very diverse culture is never going to be easy, as you have seen in the case of separation of Pakistan, for instance, or the kind of aspirations that you have had in the princely states, for example. So if you go by the records that you find in the archives, many of the officials who were handling the integration of states, they had said on record in their letters, particularly in reference to Manipur, that the integrationists were to use two important methods. One was conspiracy, other was intimidation. It's written there in B.P. Menon's work. Now the point is, the idea of union comes with a lot of difficulties if you are a very diverse culture. Therefore, nation state is mostly applicable and apt for the countries which are culturally very congruent. But state nation is much more apt for societies which are very diverse. That is the reason why I say that the very idea of union of states has to be also rethought about. And if you rethink the idea of union of states in the context of Article 1, I have a new reading which is circulated here. I've got a new reading probably. I think I have not seen many scholars or any federal scholar or constitutional expert working on these areas. I found when I was reading the Constitution again and again, I got a clue to say that Article 1 is the... let me talk about the reason of the Article 1, the rationale behind Article 1. The rationale behind Article 1 is that India has become a union. There's a rationality given by the Constituent Assembly and Ambedkar. He says that, India need not become a federal state because India did not sign any treaty covenant agreements with the states. So they came to the Constituent Assembly and they happily become part of the Constituent Assembly, and the Constitution was a product of a collective participation. Therefore, there was no agreement as such separately signed with the states to become part of the union. So therefore, India is going to be union, not a federation of states. So that is the kind of, you can find these arguments in the works of Didi Basu also. Now I was trying to reread this question, and then I found that India had to sign a lot of treaty, covenants, agreements with the state since 1935. With the enactment of Government of India Act 1935, there was a provision called, there was a separate provision for instrument of annexation. And towards the independence of India in 1947, Nehru had urged Lord Mountbatten to initiate a new arrangement so the states can have a linkage, legal connectivity with the Indian state. As a result, there was a call for states to sign the instrument of annexation, which was to kind of give away external sovereignty. That is, defense, communication, and external affairs. Now, most of the states, princely states, had signed it. And Manipur, of course, signed it. Kashmir had signed it. The only difference is that Kashmir signed the instrument annexation after the Independence Act of 1947. That is the reason why Kashmir did not sign any merger agreement. Right. There's the politics, there's the constitutional, there's a legal issue. Let me come back to that. Now let me say that if the United States exemplifies the idea that there was no treaty covenant relations with the states, but India, the Dominion of India, had to sign a lot of instrument of annexations with the states. Manipur, Kashmir, and I think Travancore, many of these signed these annexation treaties. But all of a sudden, some of them declared independence, and there were a lot of military actions to integrate these states way back in 1947, right? Coming back to the issue, I want to say that if you look at the legality and the constitutionalism in the states, it looks like many states had signed treaty covenants relations, treaty relations with the Union. And therefore, they do not actually come within this explanation that India did not sign any treaty relations with the states. I'm talking the historical aspect of the law that was coming up in the country. And if that is the case, my argument is that the idea of Article 3 has to be again read in conjunction with the scope of Article 3. Because you have created a union of state, therefore the parliament is mandated to enact any law to alter the boundary and change the names of the states, because there was no federation there. It was merely a union. Therefore the upper hand always will be with the union parliament. Now if you reverse this very argument, I think for some states which had signed treaty relations, or which had treaty relations with the Dominion of India, or India for example, should probably be kept away from Article 3 scope. That's my reading. I hope you're getting my point. Because they had signed a lot of treaty relations with India at different phases, different times. So that aspect can be re-looked at when we see the situations of state reorganization politics. And the resistance and the diversity, the complexity, the kind of situation that you witness probably in Manipur basically is also rooted in that historicity. Some politics think that their integrity is not to be altered because they had a different position in the past. Right? So the very idea of reorganization of states has to be also contextually read, given the kind of legality, the history of constitutionalism that you had experienced during the independence of the country and the writing of the constitution. And I started talking about Nehru, who was ready to even accommodate monarchies. He was not talking about monarchy in the form of the archaic one. He was saying that monarchies were becoming constitutional because they were giving right to property, right to freedom of speech, right to liberty, and many more fundamental rights to the people and to the citizens. The subjects were becoming citizens. And therefore Nehru was, I think, of the view that these monarchies were already nominal head. So therefore Indian Republic would probably accommodate them as a part of or as a unit of Indian Republic. However, he changed that position after 4 months. He was not then ready to give any kind of independence to the states. That was his official position. For instance, he told the Nagas, when the Nagas met Gandhi, Gandhi said, before a Naga is killed, I shall be happy to be shot first and I shall give you independence. That kind of position Gandhi had maintained. But if you go and ask Nehru, he said, heaven's fall, Nagas will never be given independence. So that kind of things were coming up. So what I'm trying to say is that the transition period, the idea of nation state, has a very complex personality. It is not so simple as we perceive to be. It is nothing about one XYZ state. It is more about the history of constitutionality that is important to be understood. Having said this, I want to also draw your attention to two different aspects of Northeast states, or three important aspects, in fact. Assam was part of the British province. You have to be clear with this. Assam was part of the British India province. The present Nagaland, Mizoram, or Khasi states, or Bodoland, these were not part of that province. They were excluded areas, right? Which means tribal areas. They are not part of the state system in the British India. I'm using a very important term called state system, right? The tribals never were part of that state system that you call today's state, because the Britishers were consciously not trying to integrate them within the British structure, because they were not able to understand them properly. So they left them alone. That is the reason why tribes in the Northeast normally say that we never had a state of our own, or we were never ruled, we were never colonized. Now, the idea, the historicity, the idea that they were never given a state of their own actually reverberates when they even talk today, that they need a state of their own. And that is very much relevant in the case of those excluded and partially excluded areas. But let's come to Manipur. I've talked about two issues now. One, the province, which is the Assam, and then second is the tribal areas, and third is the princely state. Now, Manipur and Tripura were princely states. The tribes within those states were fairly integrated within a state system called the native states or the princely states. However, if you look at the politics, they continue to refer to the same kind of discourse that the excluded and partially excluded tribes were giving or are giving, in fact. So I think there is a complexity that has to be also understood, that there were three layers of state system coming up. One is almost no state. The tribes were not having any state of their own. On the other side, the Assam state was very, very much part of the province, and the Manipur and Tripura were going a very different way. They have a long history of state making. I call it advanced history of state making. Because Manipur probably had its first constitution in 11th century, much before Magna Carta, I guess, much before the Westphalian Treaty. So I think there are histories of lawmaking, there are histories of constitution making, which is very important to refer to understand the politics in the region. Now I think we have done first part of the presentation. Let me come back to the second aspect.
Is it available at 11th century?
Of course I have it. I'll give you, sir. Now let me talk about identity a bit more, and then come back to self and the world that is there in the topic. Now, when I began to talk about identity, I almost sound dismissive of identity. But however, I had a footnote also. I did put a footnote that we cannot deny the actuality of identity. That is also something that I acknowledge. To enhance this very understanding of identity as a reality, as an actuality, we can also refer to why identities also emerge. And I think Paul Brass can help us. Paul Brass is a very well-known scholar in the field of ethnicity and nationalism. He though gives a constructivist view, which is slightly not going to be happy, from the perspective of the people who believe that identity politics is a reality, is a cause. For Paul Brass, identity is largely constructed, right? But he also is not going to dismiss identity because he thinks that identity has a reason to emerge, and probably underdevelopment, concentration of wealth, or misgovernance. He did say all these things. So, but the way in which identity he understands and the way in which identity has emerged today is very different. He never talked about overlapping identities. He never talked about generic identity. He only talked about identity being pursued by some section of elites. But I don't get into that kind of a framework, because identity has evolved in a very complex way today, much more than what he saw in the 1980s. So I think we are challenged by new forms of identity movement, and we require new theories to understand that. He never have thought about micro-identities within the identities. He never probably have thought about how identity becomes a mechanism for acquiring new states, right? So, and identities are not only becoming a reality. My concern is that identities are becoming territorial. But we never have thought that identities will have to be talked in terms of territory. But today, in many areas of the world, identities are territorial. And this territorialization of identity is never so simple. That's my point. Wherever you see territorial identity movements, you will of course see violence within also. Because there's struggle amongst the identities for survival, for domination, for redefining. So I think we are at least able to see that there is a need for new understanding of identity. And that is the reason why my very desire to come to CPS was basically to tell people here, and teachers and faculties here, that identity is not so simple to be understood in the binaries. And if you don't believe me, come and do some field work. Right? Then you see whether I'm right or wrong. I think we have to take identity, understanding of identity beyond what Paul Brass was trying to do. Having said this, let me go to some other scholars like Roger Brubaker, who is like going to attack identity politics like anything. He would say this identity politics is like, a groupism of people. And he would say that this identity politics is like being enhanced and sustained by some entrepreneurs. He called it entrepreneurs, ethnic entrepreneurs. I'm not using this word. He uses this word called ethnic entrepreneurs.
What's mean?
Ethnic entrepreneurs means people who profits from these ethnic movements. I think it is an added understanding of what Paul Brass was trying to. Paul Brass was quite sober and reasonable dissent, in fact, because he only talked about elites driving the identity politics. But these American scholars, sociologists, is saying it's kind of a new entrepreneurship is coming up to enhance this politics. So these are one second aspect of my presentation. Now we can talk about.
So another 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll end within that. Let me talk about the other dimension of ethnic politics, which is a reality and as an actuality. And I want to throw a question whether this Westphalian state. We begin talking about Westphalian state. I am of the view that Westphalian state doesn't have any mechanism to deal with trans-border questions. For instance, you have Hindus in Pakistan, you have Hindus in India. They don't have any mechanism to make them live together, culturally even. Instead, they probably will disband you coming to India or to Pakistan. So I think the Westphalian model of state doesn't have any capacity, at least in the case of South Asia or non-European countries, I guess. They don't have any capacity so far to deal with these trans-border cultural affinities. Now that is again a problem, because since the Westphalian states in today's world doesn't have any capacity to deal and engage with these trans-border cultural aspirations, now identity politics becomes very eminent and very violent, because now they are struggling against the borders created by Westphalian state, which they call artificial boundaries. Now I wish if these states can have a new mechanism to deal with, to engage with these cultural aspirations, so that they can have some consolation, so that they can have a future to kind of have a cultural parliament or cultural kind of a council, which is there in Europe. That is the reason why I'm saying. In Europe you have something called Sami Council, which is like from Russia to Norway, the Sami tribe, which is spread in the region, will have a council. And these Westphalian models that you have in Europe have to some extent opened up to entertain this community, to have a council to have a parliament of their own. I think in that way, to some extent, the Sami tribes have been able to reorganize and live as a community without completely debunking the legitimacy of the modern state called the Westphalian model state. Now, my point for you to talk and research in future is that what would be the response of the states that we have in South Asia or in Asian region to deal with the trans-border communities, because there are aspirations of that kind. And Manipur violence, the violence in the northeast, resonates that very question, where the states are saying no compromise on our territory. All the states, but the communities are not happy. Instead, they are saying these boundaries are artificial for us. So I think this is another layer of concern that we have to talk about, we have to think about. Now, towards the end, let me talk about the last section of my title, title of the talk, which is about self. Now, I want to say that, again, I want to refer to self in the context of what Hegel was trying to say. Hegel probably had an idea that self is always important, but self is not independent of the other. He is saying yourself cannot be isolated all the time, because self is a relative concept and you cannot deny the self from having an intersection with the other. Now, if you look at identity, they want to actually not promote this very intersectionality. So I think after 200 years or 300 years after Hegel, identity has taken a different shape, where they don't want intersections. They want to remain exclusive. I don't know why they do it, but that is the reality and actuality. Now, our question as a political science student or social science student is to understand the feasibility of these reconfiguration of identity as non-intersecting communities. My fear is that we have seen much more stronger intermarriages as societies get secularized, democratized. We get more exchange of ideas. We have more institutions of secularism. Even then, communities have become very exclusive. Now, how do you understand this contradiction? Will you allow this to happen, at least normatively? What kind of articles will you write? What kind of books will you write? Will you completely harp on that binary? Will you completely de-recognize the plurality within the identities? Will you not pay attention to the solidarities that people used to have? For instance, Armed Forces Special Powers Act was one evidence which connected people to say that we don't want these kind of laws. Now, some academics are saying these laws should be imposed in certain areas where they don't like. But scholarship cannot work like that. Normativity doesn't work like that. Political theory cannot work like that. You cannot be normative in one region and you cannot be non-normative in the other region. Armed forces will remain Armed Forces Special Powers Act everywhere, wherever they are imposed, right? So from that perspective, my concern and my willingness to be with you here was basically to raise this question. I probably have not much answer, but I think we have some serious need for rethinking identity politics. We have some serious need for the growing use of Article 3. And for instance, Kashmir is one very important example, right? Sonam Wangchuk was one of the persons who was for the creation of Ladakh as a state, and they did get it. Now he is saying all of a sudden that we were better protected under Article 370. Now we come with a different kind of problem which never we imagined. We never imagined that he would say at some point in time like that. So as we debated before the discussion, if you go to Nagaland state, for example, Nagaland state has about, I think, some 20 lakhs population, and the size is, if I'm not mistaken, 16,000 square kilometer, and Manipur is about 22,000 square kilometer, right? Now, Nagaland is one of the states in the country which has a special provision called 371A, and this is a very big law, my friends. Even then, after getting statehood in 1962, Come 2020, there is a demand for another state within the Nagaland state. Right. And that is being demanded by people in the eastern Nagaland. Now the question is, have the creation of states solved problem? Have the implementation of special provisions protected people enough? What's wrong with the system and the state reorganization in India? So it looks like to me that reorganization of states on ethnic lines or legislations on ethnic lines could probably lead to a lot of violence. And it probably looks like not very durable. Right? So then what is the solution? The solution is that you need to democratize institutions, you need to democratize identities, you need to secularize identities where that intersection is not deprived. Finally, I'm of the view that self as a political site will have to have the capacity to intersect also. Because there are certain normative obligations that you have as a self, because you live not in isolation. Even if you are an identity, you can't live in isolation. Now, if that is not understood by political theories and philosophers, we continue to mislead academics. We continue to mislead public because you deny people to become and live in certain format of solidarity, because that is much more balanced, much more equitable, and much more, peaceful. That is my perspective. I had something in my mind to say. I thought it was important, but I am missing it, I guess. I think with these words, to just conclude, I begin by talking about state in Westphalian nature. And I talked about how state was getting to be a nation state through people like Rousseau and Hegel. Then I talked about the possibility of resequencing the chronology from nation state to state nation, because if you do a real normative theoretical understanding of nation state, it looks like resequencing often becomes important. And four, I talked about constitutionalisms that you have had in times of India's transition, where many states had already got their constitution and elections, but these did not have any significant respect and significant presence in the debates that you have had in the Constituent Assembly, and that really harmed the dignity or political aspirations of many people, resulted in a lot of violence in the 1950s and 60s, and it looks like that feeling continues. There's a politics on that. And I also talked about how the Westphalian state system that you have doesn't have any significant capacity to deal with transborder aspirations. And that is the reason perhaps why you have peace talks for about 27 years. I'm not going to name the name of the organization, but peace talks in India happening for 27 years. Because some of the issues these states cannot resolve, the transborder questions, right? With these words, I really thank my teacher, Sir Manindra, and also Sir Satish. He has been guiding me. I requested him to be present here. He has come. I'm so thankful. And I thank everybody here, my colleagues, my friends and students, research scholars. I'll be very happy to respond to your queries, but I'm not here to give any lecture. I'm just throwing a lot of questions for you, because it is a very rare chance for me to come in. Right. And mind you, for me, for a person like me, it is becoming very difficult to publish things because academics have presumptions. I'm raising a very important question, my friend. It's not so easy for many of us to publish ideas because there are prejudices. Because these prejudices are informed by fixated identity perceptions. Because they are also trapped in that binaries. They're not ready to explore more ideas. And that is the reason why you will see it very difficult to get these ideas circulated in the academic world. As you know how academics unfolding today, it's of course a challenging moment for all of us. I can only thank everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.